On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to talk with you about how to explain being fired from a job when you interview or you apply with another job. If you speak Spanish and English, I'm going to talk with you about why you should sell that skill in the interview. And I'm going to play a My First Job segment with Mrs. Hanson from Moline High School. It's the week of January 20th through the 24th, and this is the QC Step Podcast. Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of the QC Step Podcast. My name is Corey Finneran, and this is actually the 50th episode of the podcast. You can connect with QC Step through Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Go to qcstep.com/Facebook, and we are at QC Step on Twitter and Instagram. And I use those to share general employment tips, job leads, and then I also share articles and blog posts on employment that I think that you might find interesting. And this week I linked a few articles. One was on what questions to ask in an interview, and the other was a blog post that I wrote. Over the last few months, quite a few of your schools have invited me into your classrooms to talk with you about how you can use social networking like Facebook and Twitter to get jobs. So I wrote a blog post specifically about using Twitter to get a job. And like I said, I linked it on Facebook and Twitter, but if you'd like to read it, you can go to qcstep.com/Twitter4job. I'm going to give the job leads at the end of this episode, but there is something that I saw on one of the leads that I wanted to talk about. The Home Depot is hiring in Davenport, and it said on that job listing that if you are bilingual, you're encouraged to apply. Speaking two languages is a real skill, and you should sell that skill on your applications and your interviews. The fact that Home Depot advertised that they're looking for people that can speak two languages, that shows you that they see the value in this skill. If Home Depot sees the value in that skill, then other businesses do too, especially the businesses that have a lot of customers walking through their doors. The bigger businesses, like the big retail stores and the grocery stores. So if you speak two languages, English and Spanish are probably the most common, but if you know any other language or if you know sign language, write that down in the skills section of the application and bring it up in the interview. Your ability to communicate and connect with a group of customers could make the difference between the business hiring you or someone else. If you are bilingual, it is a skill that you have and that most people don't. So sell that skill and let that help you get a job.
Like the legend of the Phoenix.
The QC Step Podcast is available in both video and audio on our website, qcstep.com. And it's also available in iTunes and Stitcher Smart Radio, and those are both free. Closed captioning is available for the video version, and it's provided by YouTube. Recently, I've been getting quite a few questions submitted by students, and here in a few minutes, I'll tell you how you can send in your questions. This week's question comes from a teacher, Mrs. Gresch at Sherrard High School. Mrs. Gresch asks, if you lose a job because of absences or tardies or for any reason and were not favorably let go, how do you handle explaining this on the application in an interview for another job? And that's a great question, and I'll broaden it out a little bit and talk about what to do if you were fired from a job. My first tip is don't get fired. If you have a legitimate reason that you're absent or tardy, don't let that get to the point where you're let go from that job. If your legitimate reason involves transportation, then go back to episode number 47 of the podcast. On that episode, I talk about what you should do if you can't get to work because of weather or transportation issues. If you have a real reason that you're late to work or missing work and you don't know how to communicate it with your employer, Talk with your step teacher or your co-op teacher, or talk with Gary or Carrie, and you can get in contact with them by emailing me, info@qcstep.com. So let's say that you've lost that job and you were fired for absences or tardies or really any other reason. Now you face the challenge of trying to get a job with that bad reference hanging over your head. The first decision that you have to make is whether or not you want to put that work experience on your application. And my advice is to be honest. Chances are, if you're in high school, you don't have a great deal of work experience and you don't want to leave that previous employment section of the application blank. The application will ask you for a reason for leaving. One way you could avoid writing "I was fired" on the application is to write "will explain in person." And this gives you the opportunity to explain yourself. And explaining yourself in an interview is an entire topic in itself. When you're in an interview and asked about your previous work experience, and they ask about the "will explain in person" answer on your application, be honest with them. Number one, even if you feel that your previous supervisor was mean or a jerk, don't say that in an interview. A potential employer doesn't want an employee that says that a different employer was a jerk. Number two, take the blame. Be honest with the employer. Let's say that you lost your previous job because you were late to work. You could give an answer like this. "Well, I was let go from my last job because I was consistently late to work. I was really struggling with my time management, and losing that job has motivated me to become more organized and better at time management. And I understand that if someone is late for work, that puts a burden on the employer and on the fellow employees, and I feel bad for doing that in that job. It was an important lesson for me to learn, and I've made the changes in my time management to keep that from happening again." If you're honest with what happened and you take responsibility and give an answer like that in the interview, I think it will impress an employer quite a bit. They are probably used to hearing people make excuses, and if you give an answer like that, then it might just impress them enough to give you a better chance of getting that job. An answer like that doesn't just show honesty, but it shows maturity. And if you've been fired from a job, figuring out how to explain it can be difficult. I gave this example about being fired because you were late to work. If your specific situation is a little different, talk with Gary or Carrie or email me, info@qcstep.com, and we can help you organize your answer. Thanks to Mrs. Gresch for sending in that question. I really enjoy getting student and teacher submitted questions on employment. If you have a question that you would like me to answer on the podcast, you can submit them to me on our Facebook page, through Twitter or Instagram, or you can email them to me.
I'm waking up to ash and dust. I wipe my brow and I sweat my rust. I'm breathing in.
Last year, Gary and I worked on a segment for the podcast called My First Job. And in this series, we interviewed adults and asked them about their first jobs. The purpose of this series is to show you that many of the teachers and the school staff around you, they started in positions very similar to the ones that you're either working now or that you're applying for. We also asked them for tips that they have learned in their first jobs to help you be successful in yours. So here is a My First Job segment with Casey Hansen. And Mrs. Hansen is a special education department chair at Moline High School. And her first job was as a hostess with the Cracker Barrel.
My first job was at the Cracker Barrel. I was a hostess, so I would stand at the front and people would come in and tell me how many they need seated, and then I would look at my chart and pick a table and take them to their table and tell them the specials. One of my friends actually worked there, and she said, "Hey, you should, get a job, get some extra money." And so I said, "Okay." She said she would talk to her manager to get me an interview, and she brought me the application. So really a lot of my jobs I've gotten in my life are ones where I knew somebody already, and then they would say, why don't you apply here? And so I applied at the Cracker Barrel, and she told the manager about me, so that's how I got my first interview. Yeah, I used her as a reference for my application, so they knew already that she, recommended me. Well, now you're asking me to think about quite a few years, so this could strain my memory, but all I remember about that is that she brought me the application and I filled it out, and then I think I took it in and gave it to them. I may have even called them to ask for an interview, even though she'd already spoken with them. And then I went in and we had the interview just at one of the tables at the Cracker Barrel, which I don't know if I thought that was odd. For some reason I thought there would have been an office, but maybe restaurants don't do that. It was in the afternoon, so there were customers in the restaurant, but it wasn't very busy. I just tried to ignore all of them and just give all of my attention to the person who was interviewing me. Again, this is asking me to go back quite a number of years, but I did not have to do anything with the money, the cashier part. I just basically stood at the podium, and when people came in, I asked them how many and if they wanted a breakfast menu, and then I would choose a table. The hardest part was keeping the rotation correct, because the servers would get upset if you gave too many tables to one server, so you kind of had to keep track of the rotation. And then on Saturdays and Sundays, it would get so busy that we'd have a wait, so you would have to time that. People would come up and you'd have to take down their name and tell them how long of a wait it would be, and then I would have to announce their name and go find them when they had a table. And on those days, I was running back and forth all day. Those days went really fast and I was really exhausted at the end of the day. So those were the biggest challenges of that position. And I think in any position you get, one of the biggest challenges is getting to know your coworkers and developing a good relationship with them, and just being able to be professional in that way. That always takes time. My biggest takeaway from that employment, because that was really my first job, so I think my biggest thing I learned is, how to be on time, how to talk with your boss about, hey, I need a day off, because, to rearrange your schedule, how to work with other people, because you have to be able to have that conversation, and you have to have that conversation in an appropriate or a professional way. So those are things you have to learn. And just managing a lot of interacting with other people was really what I took away from that. And just knowing the expectations of a job, being on time, and when you get to work, making sure that you do your job. And if I had downtime, then I had to learn to ask, well, what can I help with? Because a lot of times there'd be a space of time when nobody was really coming into the restaurant and it was a lull, and so then I could maybe do some stocking in the store or something, but I had to go ask to do that. I worked there for about 2 years, and then I left because I went to college and I was no longer in the area where that job was. I think the biggest thing when you're trying to get a job is that first impression that you make when you go into hand in your application. Make sure that you're dressed nice, that you look nice. Make sure you try to talk to the manager, and then give a call and ask for an interview. And if you do get the job, just make sure it's the little things. Make sure you're on time, make sure you're polite, make sure you get all of your duties completed. That would be my advice.
I post job leads to QCStep.com on Monday mornings, and then I share those leads on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And this week's leads are under the blog post, Job Leads, January 21st, 2014. And there are links to online applications for all of the job leads this week. JCPenney and Moline, that's the one at South Park Mall, they're hiring service specialist positions. The Gap Factory is opening on the Davenport, or on the Iowa side of the river in Davenport, and they're looking for stock associates. Lowe's and Moline is hiring seasonal garden workers. You need to be 18 for that position. Burlington Coat Factory in Bettendorf, they're hiring shoe clerks. And Home Depot in Bettendorf, they're hiring part-time sales associates. You need to be 18, and that is the bilingual encouraged position that I was talking about earlier. I do have one job lead for our graduates, those students that graduated at the semester. Lids in Davenport is hiring at the North Park Mall, and that's for the part-time sales help. So you need your diploma or GED for that position. As I said, there are links to the online applications for all of these job leads. And online applications are pretty tough. And if you go back and watch or listen to episode number 41 of our podcast, I give you 5 tips for filling out online applications. If you would like help with any of these applications, or if you would like help on any other applications, contact Gary or Carrie through your STEP or your co-op teacher, or if you email me, info@qcstep.com, I will pass it along to them. Well, that does it for this week's episode of the QC Step Podcast. Again, if you have any questions about employment, send them to me and I will answer them on an upcoming episode. Thank you for watching, listening, and downloading, and I will be back next week with another episode of the QC Step Podcast.